Welcome back to the London Futurists podcast. I'm David Wood, a survivor from the early days of the smartphone industry who aspires nowadays to be a radical real-world futurist.
And I'm Callum Chase, a co-founder of the AI safety startup Contium and a writer and keynote speaker on the future of AI.
Our guests in this episode are Pat Kane and Indra Adnan, the co-convenors of the Alternative Global. That project was launched in 2017 with the question, if politics is broken, what's the alternative? Pat and Indra will be speaking at the London Futurists and IEET event in London on 19th to 20th September, the Technoprogressive Opportunity, where they'll be giving an update on progress with their project. Our episode today provides a chance to dive into what they have experienced and learned. Pat is a writer, musician, curator, consultant, activist, and futurist. He is the author of the book The Play Ethic and has written for The Independent, The Sunday Times, The Guardian Observer, and Scotland's Sunday Herald, of which he was a founding editor in 1999. He is currently a columnist with The National and is researching a new book on politics, creativity, and the science of emotions. Indra is a psychosocial therapist, founder of the Soft Power Network, and a writer and events producer. She has consulted to the World Economic Forum, Indian, Finnish, and Danish governments, NATO, the Scottish Executive, and the Institute of Contemporary Arts, amongst others. She is the author of the book The Politics of Waking Up: Power and Possibility in the Fractal Age. Pat and Indra, welcome to the London Futurists podcast.
Nice to be here.
Thank you. Yeah, happy to be here.
Thank you for joining us, Pat and Indra.
Two of the themes of the Alternative Global are cosmolocalism and tech positive. What does it mean for your project to be both cosmolocal and tech positive?
Cosmolocalism was a phrase that dropped into our lap a couple of years ago, primarily from a guy called Michel Bowens, who's a peer-to-peer expert. His rendering of it was, I think the phrase is design global, make local. The whole idea that there were localities that could provision themselves and make for themselves, but draw their ideas down from the cloud and from a global resource. So it's a kind of post-industrial or post-industry which is sustainable and uses only appropriate resources. So it was a powerful enough concept. But we decided to take it into the realms of how do we live authentically on the planet in a way that we're rooted and we have a sense of confidence about who we're living with and what our vision is. We sort of expanded it into philosophical, political, ideological realms.
The human experience that it points at is that for the past 30 years, people are connected globally on a number of different levels, even as they're living with their 2 feet on the ground in whatever their locality is. So this separation between global and local doesn't really exist in the way that it did in the past. Especially over the last 30 years, the public space has changed significantly from being something that was generated and built and designed for the purpose of governance into something that is now also a transmitter of our emotions, our spirit, our connections, our relationality. We can be taking part in a global shift of emotion in the same ways we can be taking part in a global shift of production. So our experience of living on the ground in the place we're in is very, very different now from what it was 30 years ago. In terms of being tech positive, for me is really the opposite of being afraid of tech. We're interested in where technology is leading us into the future. We think about technology as an extension of what it means to be human and creative. We don't separate the two. Maybe, Pat, you'd want to say more about that.
The book that I wrote, The Play Ethic, looks at something like play as a mammalian concept rather than just a human concept. So we have a very deep-founded belief in the importance of creativity to everyday life. It's a way that social organisms can figure out how to be with each other by trying things out, by envisioning things, by using their imagination. So to be tech positive is to be positive about the human capacity for imaginative transformation of your life or of widening the options and space, wriggle room in your life to try out new things. And that's really adaptive. If you go to evolutionary theory, play shouldn't work, but it does. It's there in all its excessiveness to allow organisms to try out how to live, because we're with other complex organisms that are trying to do the same thing. So technology is just an expression of something a bit more primordial for us. It also means that you're looking for the potential in technology rather than always going to default Luddite scared mentality about it. You're looking to think, well, what can be harnessed here? You have to make a bet on human creativity, because if you don't, the story would be incredibly depressing in terms of the nuclear capacity to destroy ourselves, the various viralities of various technologies that we have at the moment. So you have to sort of think, well, we're going to make it through the gate. We're going to get through the great filter. We're going to defy Fermi's paradox. How do we do that? And you have to have a basic faith that that's possible. So we have that basic faith. And I think that basic faith is a political question. We both do. And we think that people are gripped by fears where they should be enabled by purpose. And that's partly what we're trying to say when we're tech positive.
So that was 2017. What's happened in the 9 years since then?
That's a huge question, obviously. I would say it's very much a developmental project. Where our instincts went to in the beginning was to move away from the party political system that kept parties in contention with each other and made it very difficult for citizens to come together to make agreements about how to go into the future, and move into communities where we saw that that was naturally happening all the time. And in our focus on communities and their development, we've noticed that not just around the country, but let's say globally, there's a phenomenon of people in communities becoming more connected to each other and more connected to the land. And we see the development of what we've called community agency networks. So these might take the form of eco-villages, transition towns, cooperatives, but now are becoming much more sophisticated versions of that. And our development at the Alternative UK really has been around what we call systems convening, seeing how the patterns of these communities arising is held in common between these communities, finding how they can connect to each other to create a more overarching picture of something that is emerging, let's say, outside of the political system, and then finding new formats and methods for them to grow themselves as what we call a parallel polis. That's the general development over the last 10 years.
In David's introduction, he said that you think that politics is broken. What do you think is broken about it, and what broke it?
I think there's a huge cynicism about representative politics at the moment, which has been charted for decades, but is probably at its nadir at the moment. And I think it's to do with scale. We've had various initiatives, for example, the range of devolutions that happened, say, in 1997 in the UK, where power went to the Welsh Parliament and to the Northern Irish Assembly and to the Scottish Parliament. Obviously, we're dealing with the call for devolution again with Andy Burnham. So there's a sort of general sense at which we're not getting the scale of politics right. The interesting perspective on empowered communities in a network age is that communities can find tools to give themselves a voice, envision themselves, organise themselves a way that's full of experiment and vigour and could revive the appetite for citizenship if it's conducted at the right and appropriate level. The brokenness is the sense of people feeling as if they're just waving their fists at implacable powers on high. There's been a number of initiatives. We mentioned Michel Bowen's before, but there's been a number of initiatives trying to revivify citizenship by finding the right scale and level at which it can be most effective in a technological age.
And do you think these communities that you're talking about could replace, in the UK, Westminster politics, or somehow supplement it in a way that would make people less cynical about MPs?
The way that we're imagining it is more of a new system in which two things are operating almost more like in partnership, so more like a partner state. But what's missing at the moment is anywhere for citizens really to gather, to come together and realize a future that they are imagining that really has outstripped the current political discourse. So there are many, many more ideas about moving into the future. You might say, for example, that all the solutions to our climate problems already exist. But how are we going to implement them? At community level, people are experimenting with this very energetically. They're really outpaced government. If the people have to wait for the government all the time, then the real full potential of what is available today won't be realized. So what we're imagining really is a partnership between a newly constituted, interconnected community intelligence with the government, where one is influencing the other all the time. It could come to a head in Parliament with the two chambers, a citizens' chamber and a party chamber, but that's a long time coming. So it might have to happen more autonomously, with more progress happening outside of government and outside of party politics to influence the speed at which government progresses. A good example of that would be the trend for community wealth building projects, which are happening all over the country, which now is slowly becoming of interest to the government. In Scotland, it's already become part of governmental policy. We imagine that with Andy Burnham, it's going to filter down to Westminster as well. But this was led by actual communities coming together to find new ways of making more democratically productive and holistic society.
But can these local community activities have enough power to compete with centralised governments, large corporations, global financial interests?
We can give you a very, very specific example of how this is playing out, very, very concretely, which is the whole scene of renewable local energy generation. 20 years ago, people started to set up onshore wind farms, and 20 years hence, they're now being what they call repowered, replaced. It's a real opportunity to energise democracy and democratise energy. There are a few initiatives in the islands around about and in the north of Scotland where communities who have managed to get together enough expertise capital, financial capital, cultural capital, bring themselves together to bid for their own ownership of a local wind farm. At the moment, there's sort of 1% of the total developed wind capacity of Scotland that's under those conditions. But when you look at that 1%, the level of mobilisation and motivation and strengthening of the community that is consequent upon getting yourself together to set up your own wind farm, which is the administration of it, the legalities of it, the engineering of it, the provisioning of it, the repair of it, the maintenance of it, is profoundly democratising and empowering. We can actually point to it as an example of what happens when communities literally take on the responsibility for empowering themselves. It increases people's sense of agency, their sense of purpose. They start to have ambitions, infrastructural ambitions for other parts of their island or other parts of their area. It's also very, very pecuniary. You get £3,000 per gigawatt if you sell out to Vattenfall or some Spanish renewables company. You get a six-figure sum if you run it yourself for every gigawatt you generate. That can extend into other areas. For example, if you were trying to think of yourself as a bioregion, how would you think about that in terms of infrastructure that would support and serve that? Do you think about microgrids? If you can't put your energy onto the main grid, how do you use a microgrid that serves and that strengthens the enterprise capacity of your own community? So I'm just citing that as a really specific response to you saying, how do people feel empowered? Well, literally, they go and get power in the renewables revolution. And Scotland, as you'll attest to this, David, as a good Scot, has plenty of resources to fiddle around with in that respect.
I don't know that I would go as far as to say that politics is broken, but it's in pretty poor health in many countries, including this one. It called me a cynic, and I probably am a cynic. What you're describing is fantastic. It's life-affirming. It's marvelous. I think people get a lot out of doing things like that. They produce great results. But the number of people who are willing to get involved with communities in the way that you're describing is tiny. I don't know if you monitor the percentage of the population that gets involved in these things, but I bet it's less than 1%. And yes, obviously it could go up given certain circumstances. I've heard people talk about things like this and been slightly involved in one or two of them myself all my life. They never get to be anything like a critical mass. How would you get this kind of community activity to a critical mass?
There's a lot of responses, Callum, to this. One of them would be that at the moment, we are in a particular, what one might call a Horizon 2 situation. What you're describing is a lot of experimental work happening and that catching people's imagination. That in itself generates a lot of new narrative. And that is maybe what we would describe as soft power rather than hard power. People come to hear about breakthroughs that are made in either energy or in housing or in health, actually, is a big one that people hear about. And the power of that narrative is also very persuasive in the public sphere, including persuasive to the government. So there's the generation of the soft power coming from this activity. But there's also the near future that we have to look into right now, which is that, number one, AI is going to make a lot of people redundant. There's going to be a lot of spare time. We're even thinking about, in the next 5 years, people having a lot more time on their hands. The ideal thing would be for there to be community activity or activity in your area that can pick up some of that spare time and help you continue to feel resourceful, have a purpose, give you a future to look for. It's almost as if we feel we're already rehearsing for a time in which people will be actively looking for something to do. The other possible near future is actually collapse. It could be that we'll have collapse before we have the AI transformation that Elon Musk is promising, where we're suddenly going to get universal high income. Before that could even possibly happen, we might get collapse. And there are a number of very intentional small communities right now called Lifehouse projects, which are looking at how to pick up communities as soon as collapse happens. These are very assiduous, very detailed plans for how to grow food, how to get energy. You'd be amazed at what's going on right now amongst people who are thinking collapse is imminent. So there's a lot of infrastructure being built right now for a near future that you maybe are not thinking about at all. But on the other hand, there's also the AI future, which may be coming down the line. But both of those are things that would move what I call Horizon 2 projects into possible Horizon 3 projects. Quite idealistic, holistic answers to the problems that we're about to face.
Just spell out the Horizon 1, 2, 3. What are the distinctions?
Horizon 1 is really where we are, the current system, which is chugging along. Politics is still part of that system. Horizon 2 is the experimental, perhaps entrepreneurial projects that are trying to move out of that system. So that means moving into new economic logic, moving into new relational communities, all sorts of counter-system projects. And Horizon 3 is really where some small few projects have really been able to realize really new whole systems and are living in that way already, which people can use as guides to the future.
And you talked about collapse. I don't want to dwell on the negative, but what are the scenarios in which you think collapse would take place? Because we need to know about them before they happen, ideally, rather than try and go back to living a much more impoverished lifestyle.
Sure. We have a blog called The Daily Alternative, and I just blogged a climate scientist who is just despairing about the level at which we're going to be pumping carbon into the atmosphere, regardless of initiatives, regardless of good behaviour and practice. The presets are all heading for above 2 degrees of warming disaster. There's the finitude of collapse, there's the disrupted food chains, there's the extreme climate events. On one side, finitude. On the other side, we're presented with this infinitude, this exponential curve of artificial intelligence, general intelligence, superintelligence, whatever it's going to be. Humankind sets itself up for some pretty delicious conditions. And the question that we keep asking ourselves and asking others is, where are the spaces in which the people that matter in this can deliberate? We have lots and lots of, say, citizens' assemblies, and we have lots and lots of initiatives that help to get small groups of people chosen by sortition to respond to big issues. We are interested in the way that the future is often defined for communities by those who arrogate to themselves the right to define the future. The moguls, the tech bros, the great technological visionaries and corporates. And we talk to lots of artists and lots of facilitators and lots of people who are expert in dealing with humans about this. We want to bring strategic foresight and strategic vision to a much lower level of community than it currently exists in, which is mostly at the corporate or the Hollywood or the fictional level. We want to make many more people futurists so that they can look at these scenarios, this finite climate limits, infinite computation and intelligence, and try to figure out in a semi-science fictional way how to get to a much better arrangement than looks likely for us at the moment and that we can devise. There's a sense in which giving people the right to be imaginative and futurist at the level at which they live, at the level of their power supply or their ecological setting, and build things, experiment with structures from the available technology that's around us to make concrete a life that's livable under these conditions. Because otherwise it's quite easy to be despairing, as you say, David. The imagination that's got us into this predicament is the imagination that will get us out of it. But who are the Imagineers? Who are the people building the structures that answer their desires for a better life? We think they need to be relocated back down to the level of the community, the region, the entity that feels as if it's in touch with its resources and its fellows and its structures of power, but futurist as well.
I don't know that the imagination that's got us into the current situation is the imagination that's going to get us out of it. It seems to me that AI is clearly our most pressing issue because assuming superintelligence is coming, and there's every reason to think it is, it's going to be with us certainly within 20 years. It's inconceivable. It'll take longer than that, probably 10. And that is the result of technologists, scientists. The people at large, the bulk of the human race, had nothing to do with it, really. And it's a source of constant amazement to me that the bulk of the species is still, despite it being so close, paying pretty much zero attention to it. It now is starting to be talked about in the media with slightly less sneering ignorance. Journalists are slightly less inclined now to say, oh, well, this is just all silly science fiction coming out of some foolish people in San Francisco. But they still haven't really got it. They still don't really understand it. And most people aren't paying any attention whatsoever. I just find this amazing. We've got self-driving cars, we've got the large language models doing the miraculous things they do, and people are still not thinking seriously about the fact that we are going to make ourselves chimpanzees within about 10 years or so. So we need a different sort of input. We need the input of everybody because what happens next can't be the decision, well, shouldn't be the decision of the technologists and a few policymakers who got us to where we are. It should be a decision for everybody to take. But everybody's not interested. So the trick is to wake everybody up. And with the best will in the world, I'm just not convinced that your communities are going to get us there. It may be that when full automation happens, if we survive that, and if society doesn't break down and we're not all murdered by marauding crowds of starving people, that we have some sort of switch to community-based local politics. That may happen. But there's so many other pathways. It's really hard to see what can happen. Obviously, what we should be doing is pausing, but we're not going to do that. We should be working out a plan for what the economy could look like in a post-full automation world.
Don't mistake our idea of communities as only meaning place-based communities. That's really where probably the best stuff happens, where we can easily see what's going on. But communities really is just to describe how people come together. It could be happening in any sort of way. But there's some possibility, let's see. None of us really know what's going to happen with the AI race. We don't know what the quality of life is. We don't know what the impact on our lives will be. But there's already many signs that people will be turning away from that and trying to re-establish real-life human connection. That's already happening amongst young people who are a little bit turning away from their computers towards more live experiences together, valuing in-person connection. That could happen at a much greater level. And of course, it could happen kind of with collapse. What happens with collapse when all the supply lines are down and our computers are cut off and we're literally walking the streets? At the moment, we can't see. I don't know if there's ever been a moment in history quite like this.
I think we can see. I think we've seen it all over the world many times over. When there are wars, when there are famines, when there are plagues, you see what happens when the supply lines break down. There is mass death. There's marauding crowds of people killing each other.
We can see looking back what happened, but this is a time when we are contemplating looking forward. We're sitting here having this conversation about what might happen with a possibility of doing something to prepare for that. That's not something that was privileged before. That's why we're really keen for people to wake up. My book, The Politics of Waking Up, is trying to log what's been happening over the past 30 years which has been because people have been so super connected and have so much access to information. This has been an era of people waking up, and it's caused actually chaos. So we have the chaos of people waking up, finding each other, not being organized across the piece, self-organizing in many, many different ways. This is the era of woke, right? Wokeness has caused so much backlash in America, trying to pull us back to a kind of conservative, more controllable society. But all of us are watching and we're all commenting. We're not anymore simply the victims of fake news. Now we're talking about fake news, managing fake news, responding to fake news. There's nothing that we can't discuss and talk about at this time, and that includes the coming of AI. Let's move into that space of let's really decide how we're going to respond to AI.
And it's quite interesting to look at the fact that in the next American general election, it's generally assumed that AI is going to be the number one topic, and the number one mode of activism is local resistance against hyperscale data centers being set up in localities. The kind of discussion that we need to have about this technology is how much compute does a good society need? And what are we scaling up for? At the moment, this is a way in which the pitchforks can be glinted at the tech elites that seem to have no response and no reciprocity to the populace, whatever. But I keep thinking about not so much Luddism as neo-Luddism in this context. As I'm sure you both know, the original phrase of the Luddites was, is this technology hurtful to the commonality? Is it hurtful to the commonality? Which also implies if it's not hurtful to the commonality, then we can support it. If it makes for shorter working weeks, a shorter working day, or if it improves the quality of the product. Now, that kind of constructive, sophisticated Luddite perspective is around. I would like for there to be a sideline where we say, as we used to say in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and as John Maynard Keynes said in his paper in the 30s, Economic Consequences for Our Grandchildren, how do we live wisely, agreeably, and well when the machinery becomes so powerful that we have to decide that we are going to fundamentally redistribute the actions of our lives in a more caring, a more cultural, a more self-developing direction? People striving for those lifestyles in communities, whether they are aided and abetted by artists and permaculturalists and various other people, are planting a flag in the future by the way that they live. I think we will be surprised in the same way as something like civil rights is a marginal activity and then sweeps America in the 60s. I think we might get a post-work, post-jobs, post-materialist wave of people looking for options, looking for ways to assert their vision and the quality of their life over and above technology and deploying technology to serve it. And I'm speaking as a musician, as a working musician who goes out every other weekend to people who want to fill rooms and have epiphanies. I think there is demand for a kind of lifestyle militancy that would look at these technologies and say, this is the kind of life that we want, and we want you, or we want these techs to serve that. So an intense romanticism, capital R romanticism, I think is back on the cards, because it's a way of asserting not just defensively being human, but proactively, imaginatively being human. I think that's going to become a popular politics in the same 5 to 10 years that the AI and super AI comes to being.
You've got a new initiative called Spring. How does that differ from what you've been working on previously? Does that tie in with the movements, the trends, the shifts in zeitgeist that you've just been describing?
So we decided in year 8 of our project that we needed to move from what we call the map to the territory. We were living in London before, and being systems conveners, very much a media project, doing the Daily Alternative, looking at what was arising. But we felt ourselves strongly that if we wanted to accelerate our own cause, we should move to somewhere where we felt it was happening on the ground. For that reason, we moved to Scotland. We're now living in Edinburgh because we had a sense that the culture of community activity was strong. The parliament was a proportional system. Energy was a very attractive idea to organise around. A lot of good reasons for us to move to Scotland, for us to be on the ground with a project. And we called it Spring to make a distinction between the earlier version, which still continues. The alternative is continuing in the background, reporting on global initiatives. But Spring is more focused on working on the ground. And so we have developed in Scotland what we call a consortium of actors. This is people who are, on the one hand, land development people, political entrepreneurs, media people, technology people. So different forms of agency. And we're working now as a group to transform activities at community level. That's really what the difference is. And Spring, as you can tell from the name, is really all about being able to spot the green shoots of a new system appearing and capturing the energy of something that you know is coming into being rather than something that has already matured or been around for a long time.
And just to be concrete about it, we had a very successful event in January, a festival called Celtic Connections, which is a great artistic, musical, performative festival. But we did something there called Power Shift, which was a mix of genres, experts, improvisers, musicians, futurists, ceilidh dancing, all manner of different things jumbling together to help people think about this question of democratising energy and energising democracy that's happening in the renewables area in Scotland. We're here in Festival Edinburgh. Festival is the land of artistic fusion. What we're trying to do is create initiatives that evade the trap of being too political for the cultural people and too cultural for the political people. The question of how people are motivated to be resilient as citizens is really central to what we're doing. There's lots and lots of political entrepreneurs, political technologists who believe that they have the hot button to trigger primal emotion in citizens and get them to do what they want to do. We were talking about the neuroscientist Mark Soames, his whole vision of the primary emotions. One of them is play and care. There's also anger, fear, panic. So we're in a situation where there's lots and lots of triggering of the human condition going on to make people feel something so that they choose the facts that fits their triggered feeling. It's quite a battleground. And we are talking to people who are interested and skilled in narrative, people who are artists, people who are musicians, people who can get to the heart of people. Not do agitprop, not just do message art, but find ways to create moods of aspiration and hope in people, of belief in humanity, and set that sophisticatedly in the context of, well, what knowledge do we need to set up this structure or that structure in our locality? We call it ceilidh theatre. We're trying to create hybrids to make that happen.
I guess I have two fundamental issues with what you're describing. And I do applaud a lot of it. It sounds, as I say, very life-affirming and wonderful. But firstly, as I said before, I just don't see that many people being interested. I think it's a tiny, tiny minority of people are being interested. And secondly, when we cross the threshold and we have full automation, so there's no jobs for humans, or when we cross another threshold and there's superintelligence and we become the second smartest species on the planet, I don't think that community responses are going to be really much use at all. If and when society collapses because we mismanage these transitions or we fail to manage them, the prospect of that kind of social collapse is appalling. Many people will starve. Those that don't will be roaming the countryside looking for food and killing each other. You mentioned, Indra, that we have the opportunity to think about collapse in a way that previous civilizations, previous generations didn't. I don't think that's true. I think we actually don't think about it at all because we've had a stable, relatively stable civilization for a surprisingly long time. In previous eras, people were used to their societies collapsing. It was actually the norm. Famine, war, and death did it a lot. England's had several civil wars. There's always empires crashing into each other and causing local absolute chaos. And people were terrified of it because they knew that there was a really good chance of them dying in a horrible way when it happened. And so they went to enormous lengths to make sure there was some form of authority. And that form of authority was absurdly anti-democratic. It was a king who was usually a brutal, nasty person, but they kept order, and that was the main thing. And society didn't collapse. What worries me is people are so cynical about today's politics that they think, oh, well, let's have somebody come and drain the swamp and turf out all the establishment. Trump in America and Farage in Britain. People who vote for those people have no idea what it would involve if the establishment really did collapse. They would all die. It would be horrible. We need a plan, which I do think has probably got to be top down, to help us survive the transition to full automation and to superintelligence. I don't think a plan is going to emerge bottom up. And the way we're going at the moment, there isn't going to be a plan. And so we are going to get a collapse.
I fully acknowledge how you're feeling about this, Callum. I'm not unfamiliar with that narrative. However, you might have to take it on trust that you're in a different algorithm from me.
I will take that on trust.
And that every day we're looking at something that most people are not looking at. Maybe this will be the first time one of your listeners will think, oh, maybe there's something else that's happening that this current media is deliberately keeping from me. The media that the mainstream is in is upholding the current socio-economic political system and its ways and means and keeps us feeling disempowered. That's the deal. So that we continue to follow, we continue to pay our taxes, we continue to work jobs that we hate, so that we stay on the hamster wheel. That's the deal. That's the one that you're in. We deliberately stepped outside of that and started to think about, is there an alternative to that? And when you start to look, you find, well, actually, maybe there is one. You start to look at people differently. You start to see the way that they self-organize. You start to appreciate what a community is. And slowly you start to build up a new sensibility altogether. And when you're doing it to the extent that we're doing it, which is every day, putting out a newsletter every week, we're probably talking about things that most people listening to this podcast will never have heard of. Why? Because the mainstream media doesn't show it to you.
What's the name of the newsletter?
The newsletter is The Daily Alternative, comes out every week. You go to our site, thealternative.org.uk, you sign up. And I can tell you that being there and living in that world is like having two worlds going on at the same time. I'm not surprised you don't feel trust in the future if you haven't got access to an alternative reality in the way that we've been building. Sometimes you see these two things cross over. For example, that moment in time when Greta Thunberg sat outside her school with a placard, suddenly across the whole mainstream media, there was the picture of this young woman who ended up shaping the environmental policies of many major governments. ISIS, of course, did the same. There's a small band of rebels who ended up shaping the policy of many foreign office and defense systems. There's a lot that can be done through narrative, not only done through awareness. But yes, you are reporting from the mainstream, and I just sympathize.
And the narratives that you include in the newsletter, they're not just community local, they are online virtual networks as well.
Yeah.
Where people are finding each other and they're building a rapport and a different way of thinking and different way of looking at things.
And it's interesting as a journalistic editorial exercise, David, because you end up using big words like ontology and epistemology, which is to say, what's the worldview that you select week in, week out, day in, day out? What do you choose to prioritize? We are plugged into many, many rich networks. Our news agenda comes from them. People trying things out on a far-off continent or deep diving and coming up with a new theory and trying to apply it to something they're practically doing in this country. And what's come through and what's been built up over the last nearly 10 years is an archive which has been categorized and taxonomized and which gives people the opportunity to look at hundreds of examples of different kind of practice about how to do community tech or how to do food or how to do democracy or how to think about artificial intelligence or how to think about advanced computation. And we present that as a model to people, as a kind of technique that people could deploy to strengthen their communities, to create a kind of media platform that values what's important in front of them. So that's the old citizen journalism vision. But two, has a theory about how to get from here to there, has a sort of futurist ambition, which says that we think these things are important. It's so interesting in terms of people's skepticism about fake news. The opposite of fake news is usable news. News that comes to you and brings a technique to you, or brings a way of doing something, or brings a technology, or brings a practice that you can put into your own life and immediately improve your own life. It could easily come from a television show as much as it comes from an agricultural field or a community workshop, or it could come from an academic department. So we're imagining the brain of our ideal citizen as we're doing this network, as we're doing this newsletter, as we're running this blog. We have a couple of thousand people who are sticking with us. We present it as a method for community. Be your own media. Don't bemoan your own media. Be your own media and be ambitious about what that content could be.
Perhaps there's time just for one more question, which is if we look ahead to 2031, if we were to invite you back on our show, assuming there hasn't been a terrible collapse by then, maybe there's been rumors of a collapse or intimations of a collapse which have helped to crystallize people's thinking. But if you were to come back in 2031, what would need to have happened over these 5 years for you to be able to say, yes, the alternative really is thriving? Spring has sprung.
Let me go first. I'm sure Pat would also like to have something to say here. For me, what is already taking shape now would need to accelerate somewhat, which is the global network of community agency networks doing the regenerative work that we see slowly coming into being. We have a term for this, eco-civilization. Eco-civilization is a word that we didn't invent. It's just appeared in many different places around the globe and has become a kind of umbrella term for networks of community agency networks, so to speak, of agentic, regenerative, alternative systems in full emergence. And that itself, constituted in some way in a parallel polis, could become represented in the parliament, but it should be constituted first so that the representation has a constituency to represent.
Yeah, I think some kind of federation or some kind of overarching structure that maybe has responded to some kind of slight scare of some description, whether it's a food shock or a climate shock or an infrastructure energy shock. And in the manner of the neoliberals who constantly said the point is to have ideas lying around and practices lying around to be ready to pick up in a crisis. That's what we think we're part of doing with the Alternative Global and with Spring. We're putting ideas out that can be used to respond well to a crisis rather than in a panicked way. For example, just to take community renewable energy, the idea that that sector could quadruple, quintuple, sextuple, and could see itself as a way of not just doing resilience, which is kind of riding with the punches, but strengthening of community, deepening of community by virtue of finding ways to provide for yourself and finding ways to do that in a technologically advanced way. We're very much fans of Mo Gaudat, the ex-Google executive, who says, when it comes to AI, these are our children, and what are we teaching our children? We're teaching our children to gamble, to fight wars, to exploit other people, to control and surveil other people. We have to be treating our children to do better. Just to finally conclude on this, I would like there to be, coming out from what we're doing, a revived and confident visionary humanism that has found a way to deal with exponential artificial intelligence development, found a way to turn it into more free hours in the working week, turned it into the redistributions of wealth or accretions of wealth, sovereign wealth entities that can support people's free activity. I would like that politics to be locked in, and I think it has to come from the bottom up and horizontal demands of people as much as it comes from Sam Altman or Darius Amadeo writing a paper and sending the PDF out and expecting it to be executed. I think it has to come from below as much as from above. And I would like to see that politics of post-work and strong community determination of that to be manifest in 2031.
I'm looking forward to this politics of post-work, moving from a focus on work ethic to a focus on play ethic, a focus on regeneration as opposed to a focus on collapse. Thanks, both of you, very much for being the guests on the London Futurists podcast, and I, for one, am looking forward eagerly to hearing what you're going to talk about in London on the 19th and 20th of September. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Great, David. Thank you.